Hello again. So today we're going to look at how to navigate using the ADF. My last video was kind of an introduction to the instrument, but today we're actually going to use it. So I mentioned before that there's two ways you can navigate using the ADF. The first method is called homing. This is very straightforward. You tune the frequency of the NDB you want to fly to into the ADF radio. Turn so that the ADF indicator is pointing to 0 degrees, and simply continue flying until you reach the NDB. Normally you can tell when you've reached it because the ADF arrow will spin and point in the opposite direction as you pass over the NDB. Unfortunately, while this is nice and easy, it's an inefficient way to fly. Let me show you an example. So I'm going to start a flight directly west of the Inverness NDB and fly using the ADF back to Inverness Airport. So as we look at it here, we should simply fly in a straight line back to Inverness, right? Let me show you what happened. So here's the recording of my flight, and you can see that I'm flying at a heading of 090 degrees and the ADF arrow is pointing straight ahead at 0 degrees. Everything's looking good so far. However, as time goes by, keep an eye on my heading indicator. As the flight progresses, I have to adjust the heading to keep the ADF needle pointed to 0. I'll give you a second to think about why that might be. So those of you who said the wind is causing that, give yourselves a pat on the back. I deliberately didn't mention it because I'm going to have the wind blowing from north to south during the flight, or in this case from left to right. Unfortunately, the FSX weather glitched out shortly after this point of the recording and completely messed up my example, but this is what's happening. As we fly along, the wind is blowing us sideways away from the NDB, so we have to turn to compensate for that. The result is that we end up flying an arc to the NDB like so. This is bad because we end up flying a longer route to the NDB, meaning it takes longer to get there, and we also end up using more fuel. So the preferred and more accurate method of navigation is called tracking. Tracking will allow us to fly towards and away from an NDB in a straight line and on a specific bearing. So when we talk about bearing, we're talking about the position of one object in relation to another. Now there's two types of bearing we need to know when flying. We have relative bearing and magnetic bearing. Relative bearing is a direction of an object relative to the aircraft's heading. Magnetic bearing is a direction of an object relative to magnetic north, or 000 degrees. So let's look at this picture. The aircraft is flying a heading of 090 degrees, and the ADF indicator is pointing to 330 degrees. So the NDB is on a relative bearing of 330 degrees. That's the bearing relative to the aircraft. So if we wanted to fly to the NDB, how would we do that? Because turning to a heading of 330 degrees would not take us towards it. This is where we need a little bit of maths. So the formula is heading plus relative bearing gives you the magnetic bearing. So in this case it would be 090 plus 330, which gives you 420. Now of course there's only 360 degrees on the compass, so we would need to subtract 360 from 420, and that gives us 60. So we would need to fly a heading of 060 to fly to the NDB. I hope that's clear. If you need to pause or rewind the video to go over that again, please do. However, if you don't fancy working all that stuff out, then you are in luck. Modern ADF indicators have something called a movable card RBI. RBI simply stands for Relative Bearing Indicator. We can use this knob and adjust the markings around the outside of the indicator. When we fly using the ADF, we will want to adjust it so that the number at the top of the instrument matches our current heading. Let's look at this example from before, but with the RBI adjusted to match our heading. This is great because it tells us the magnetic bearing of the object straight away. There's no need to calculate it. So you can see in this picture that it's pointing at 060 degrees already, so we know that if we turn to a heading of 060 degrees, we'll head straight towards it. Easy peasy. So let's look at a couple of live examples so you can see how it works. For now, let's just assume that there's no wind. Okay, so here we are from the plane, and immediately you can see I've decided to change things around a bit. I'm flying at night this time round, and we're just going to try and find our way back to Inverness Airport. I know roughly where we are, but I don't know exact positioning, so what we'll do is we'll use the ADF and we'll try and find our way back to Inverness Airport now. So, the first thing to do is to tune the ADF radio, so we'll tune it down to 328, which is the frequency for Inverness Airport there. Okay, so you can see the ADF needle has swung round, so it looks like the airport is round about just behind us. So the other thing that we want to do first of all is make sure that we're actually tuned into the correct NDB station. So what I'll do is I'll just hit the ADF button and we'll listen out for the Morse code. Yeah, that's definitely NDB there. Good stuff. So, next step would be to determine what heading that we need to fly to get back there. So, at the moment we're flying a heading of 300 degrees. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to adjust the RBI, or the ADF indicator here, to 300 as well. And then we'll know exactly what heading we need to fly to get back to Inverness. There we go. Okay, so it looks like we need to fly a heading of, I think that's 105. So what we'll do is we'll spin the plane round now to a heading of 105, and then we should be pointed directly back at Inverness. So it should be in there. So yeah, the reason I've decided to do this at night time is this is more of a kind of a realistic situation when you would be using, flying by instruments rather than flying by, VFR or what you can see out of the plane. So this is a bit more of a realistic kind of setting for using instrument flying. So yeah, we're almost there, so probably another 5 degrees to the right. And then we're flying back towards Inverness. So there you go, that's one example. Again, I'm not using any wind settings in this for the time being, but what I'll do is I'll show you one more example just to kind of prove the concept basically. Okay, so here we are flying along again. This time we're in quite a lot of snow. This is very appropriate for Scotland, shall we say. So we're just going to follow the same steps again to find our way back to Inverness. So first thing, tune the radio into 328. And watch for the needle to move, which it does. Excellent. So we can see it's kind of off to our left hand side at the moment. Next step will be to make sure that it is Inverness that we're tuned into, so listen out for the Morse code. Yep, that's Inverness. Good stuff. And then what we'll do is we'll adjust our RBI to the correct heading so we know what heading to fly to get back to Inverness. So we're currently flying a heading of 160 degrees, so we'll change that around just now. Okay, so it looks like we need to fly a heading of roughly 100 to get back, so we'll do that just now. And then once the turn's completed, we should be heading straight back towards Inverness. And again, in this example there's no wind. I'm about to cover that in the next kind of section of the video. There we go, so the turn's completed, we're heading pretty much straight back towards Inverness now. So there you go, that's two examples of using the ADF, basically. Now, let's take it up a notch. Let's say that we want to fly a specific bearing to an NDB. Another way of saying this is that we want to approach the NDB from a specific direction. Here's what I mean. Imagine our example from before. We're flying a heading of 090 degrees. We tune into the NDB, we adjust the RBI and discover that the NDB is on a magnetic bearing of 060 degrees. This time, however, let's say that we want to approach on a bearing of 020 degrees. How would we do that? It's actually quite straightforward, but we need to look at the overhead picture of things just to make it a little bit easier. So we have this situation again, but this time we want to approach in this direction, indicated by the yellow line. What we need to do is fly in a direction to intercept that bearing, basically make the paths cross. Our current heading of 090 will be fine for this example. So how do we know when we reach that intercept point? How do we know when to turn onto that bearing of 020 degrees? Well, as we continue flying, the ADF needle will continue to move. We would simply wait for it to point to 020 and then we turn onto that bearing / heading. Very easy. Okay, so moving on to the last bit of the video, let's look at how we can account for wind when flying with the ADF. So I'm going to use a technique called bracketing to find a suitable wind correction angle. This involves turning the plane into the wind and then doubling or halving that correction angle as necessary to keep the plane on the correct bearing. This will be best shown during a flight, but first let me explain how I'm going to set things up. So I'm going to fly the same situation I had when I talked about homing. I'm going to start directly west of Inverness with the wind blowing from north to south with the wind speed unknown. So let's jump into the plane and see how we use bracketing. Okay, so here we are back in the plane. You'll see that I'm actually flying in the A2A Cessna. It's just because the dials in this plane are a bit clearer, so it's going to be a bit easier for me to demonstrate what's going on. So if we zoom into our instruments here, we're on our heading of 090 degrees and the ADF needle is pointing directly ahead. So that means that we're on our bearing and everything's going fine at the moment. However, as I said, I've got the wind blowing from north to south, so that is going to slowly push us off course. And what will happen is we'll see that we're starting to get blown off course, because the ADF needle will start to deflect to one side or the other, depending on what direction the wind is coming from. So what we're going to do is we're going to use bracketing to correct and fly the plane into the wind and find that ideal angle so that we fly directly towards Inverness on a bearing of 090 degrees. So we'll zoom in now and you can see that the ADF needle is starting to turn to the left. So what we need to do is we need to turn the plane to the left into the wind to correct for that. So I'm going to do that now and I'm going to turn, let's say, 10 degrees to the left. And you'll see that the ADF needle is now pointing to the right. What we're looking for is our wind. If we want to make sure that we're on the correct bearing, we want the wind correction angle, or the deflection on the heading here, to be the same as the deflection on the ADF indicator. So if we've turned 10 degrees to the left on our heading, we want the ADF indicator to show that we've the NDB is 10 degrees to our right, which means that we're on our original bearing. So we've turned 10 degrees to the left, and now what we're doing is we're just going to keep an eye on the ADF indicator and watch to see what the pointer does. If the pointer continues to move to the left, that means that we're still getting blown off course. So what we need to do is we'll need to make a greater wind correction to try and get ourselves back on course. If the needle starts to move to the right, back towards the 10 degree mark that we want, then that means that the wind correction angle is sufficient and we're heading back onto our original bearing. So looking at the needle here, I think it's very slowly moving to the left still. As I said, we've turned 10 degrees to the left, so we want this to be pointing 10 degrees to the right, this marker here, and it doesn't seem to be going in that direction. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to increase my wind correction angle again to 20 degrees. So do that one there. So it now turns 20 degrees to the left. So we want the ADF indicator to display 20 degrees to the right. At the moment it's showing 15. So what we'll do is simply you just need to be patient and wait and see what the ADF indicator does. So we now know that a wind correction angle of 10 degrees is not enough. So we know now that our wind correction angle will be greater than 10 degrees to the left. So what we need to do now is we just need to wait and see if 20 degrees will bring us back towards our bearing, or if we need to turn even sharper into the wind. We may need to turn 30 degrees into the wind. Of course, if the needle just stays still, then that means that we found our ideal angle. Okay, so a couple of minutes have passed and the needle hasn't moved at all, so I think that 20 degrees is just about right, just about the right wind correction angle. However, we're still not on our correct bearing because we've turned 20 degrees to the left. However, our ADF indicator is still only showing 15 degrees to the right. And as I said earlier, we want these two to equal to make sure our correct bearing. So what I'm going to do just now is I'm going to turn 30 degrees to the left to try and re-intercept that bearing. And what we want is we want the ADF needle to point 30 degrees to the right. So hopefully what should happen now is the ADF needle should start to move to the right over to this marker here, and then once it's reached that point, then I'll turn the plane back to a 20 degree correction angle, and then hopefully that should be enough to fly straight into the NDB there. And that's basically what bracketing is you make a correction, and then based on what the ADF needle tells you, you either increase or decrease that, and you basically just kind of narrow the gap in between until you find that ideal angle. Sometimes it'll be nice and simple, like a 5 degree or a 10 degree increment. Sometimes it'll be completely random, like maybe a 17 degree correction. So it's really just practice it, set yourself up in a way that you can practice it, and just go back and forth, and it does make sense after a few attempts, so don't worry about it too much. So you can see the ADF needle now is starting to creep back towards the 30 degrees, so that means that we're flying back onto our original bearing of 090, which is exactly what we want. So when the ADF needle lines up with this marker here, what I'll do is I'll turn the plane back to a correction angle of 20 degrees, and then hopefully that should be pretty accurate, and that should get us flying back in towards Inverness. And hopefully I can demonstrate that before we get too close to Inverness and the weather decides to throw the plane about a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty much there now. So what I'll do is I'll turn the plane back to a 20 degree correction angle. And then hopefully this will, you can see the ideal scenario that we wanted in the first place here. So we've deflected 20 degrees to the left from our original heading of 090, and the ADF needle is pointing 20-ish degrees to the right. But that's what we want. Is we want the heading and the ADF needle to be pointing in opposite directions, but by the same amount, if that makes sense. Now if you have a look outside, there's Inverness there. You can see that we're kind of being blown sideways towards it. And as with NDBs, the closer you get to the NDB station, the needle will start to move a bit more. So you can see here that the ADF needle's now actually gone beyond 20, so that means that the correction angle might still be a bit too sharp. We're actually flying now on the opposite side of the bearing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce it to 15 degrees and see if that is a bit better. So as I said earlier, we knew that 10 degrees wasn't enough. 30 degrees definitely was too much, and 20, now that we're getting a bit closer, seemed to be a bit too much there as well. So we'll try 15. So again, that's bracketing. That's just kind of, you just kind of work down and down until you kind of narrow it down to the ideal angle there. You can see we're kind of approaching Inverness now. So even in bad weather, the weather was, especially if you're flying in a private, with a private pilot's license, the weather wouldn't be so bad. Even if you were flying by instruments, you'd be able to see the landscape by about now. So you should have a good idea of where you are. Oh, it looks like the weather's going to behave itself this time. Excellent. So you can see, so admittedly it wasn't the best example that I've done there, but hopefully that's kind of giving you an idea of what bracketing is and how you use that with the ADF indicator and the heading to kind of fly a specific bearing and account for wind drift as well. Okay, so there you have it. That's a basic look at the ADF and how you can use it to navigate. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I know that I might not have managed to explain things as clearly as some of my previous videos. Quite honestly, I had a real challenge making this video because I understand what an ADF is and what it does, but I was really struggling to translate that understanding into this video, but I think I've done okay. If I haven't, I'm sure you'll let me know. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. In my next video, we'll be looking at DME, or distance measuring equipment. Hope to see you there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you later.